New England. Zoom conference, also, AKA panel discussion about basically covering the national response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a police officer, and to police violence everywhere. And basically, this is a little different discussion than some of the others that I've watched, probably because this is really we're talking about journalism, but of course the issue of police brutality is not just in the background but at the forefront. So it'll be a large part of this discussion. I'll introduce myself real quick. My name is Chris Faraone. I am a board member of SPJNE New England, but I'm also the editor-in-chief of Dig Boston, Alt Weekly in New England, as well as the co-founder of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism. And we are out there covering this. And just to say real quick, I was asked to do this not just because I cover these issues, but because I was beaten by NYPD while covering Occupy Wall Street pretty badly, and sued the city of New York for 4 years in an excruciating battle. We may get to some lawsuit stuff later, but first I want to introduce the people who are really generous to join us tonight. This is an incredibly busy time for reporters, so let's do it. So first let's introduce Harry Colbert Jr., an award-winning journalist who is joining us from the Minneapolis area, has been a commenter for various publications, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Metro Networks, others. And it's really great because Harry has worked with big publications, small publications, and on top of everything is on the ground where this leg of these protests started. And Harry was recently with Insight News in Minneapolis, a journal of business and arts, and we will definitely be talking about this, took a new job a week and a half ago, Harry?
About 2 weeks ago.
About 2 weeks ago at North News, which specifically covers North Minneapolis. And we'll get to that. And I can't wait to ask what that's like to get in the editor's chair at this moment. Next, we have Kristen Graham, an urban education reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer for 2 decades. Kristen started in college, just told me, and is still there. Pulitzer Prize winner for work on a team writing about violence in schools. And thank you very much, Kristen, for joining us. And of course, Kristen wrote a personal essay about being arrested in Philadelphia, covering protests. Was it last week, Kristen? I don't want to mess up.
It was Monday, June 1st.
June 1st. So thanks again for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. Third, we have Gabe Rottman, a senior attorney at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in DC. And not just, that's obviously beyond relevant in and of itself, but even more specifically than that, working on issues at the intersection of technology and press freedom, and certainly the perfect person to have on this in this discussion. So I appreciate you all being here, and I think I'm going to I'm gonna have some specific questions for everybody, but we're also going to throw some to the group. But Krista, why don't we start with, I know that even a large outlet like the Inquirer has so many boots on the ground, so many people covering this, and you're an education reporter, and I certainly I'm sure that there are overlapping issues here, many of them, but in general, how similar is covering these protests and police violence to the beat that you're typically on?
Well, I mean, in obviously there's a lot of overlap because I saw, students on the street for sure. But, typically with my education coverage, it's more enterprise driven. There is a fair amount of breaking news, but certainly nothing like this. I mean, in other parts of my career, I have covered, police issues. I've certainly covered protests and, fires and lots of general news assignments. But in this case, I raised my hand to cover the protest. I just felt like it was a really important issue. Our editors were very clear that they weren't, both with COVID-19 and with the protest, they weren't going to send out anyone who didn't want to go. They weren't going to require anyone to go, but I felt like this is, a huge issue and something that is, relevant to the communities that I cover, and I wanted to be there. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty different from my day-to-day now, but I have covered, issues like this in the past. Hold on.
Sorry. Yeah. You all have
it.
me muted. When I mute myself, I couldn't unmute it. I apologize. Thank you very much, Kristen.
Sure.
All right. So Harry, here we are. This is the one that I didn't even ask you this much, too much about this beforehand, because I just can't wait to hear it. You are at a new publication.
Yeah.
As of a couple weeks ago, and obviously this was, these issues have always been there, but I'm sure you weren't expecting to walk into this. So I don't know, what's this transition been like? And I guess it goes without saying that you kind of hit the ground running, or what?
Yeah, feet to the fire, absolutely. So I was with Insight News for 10 years, 4 years, the most recent 4 years as the managing editor there, but as small staff. So when you're the managing editor, you're the janitor. Yeah, I mean, you do everything. So I was actively reporting as the managing editor there. And then as of May 11, I took over as the editor-in-chief of North News, which is also a small community newspaper here in North Minneapolis. And North News is actually, Insight News is part of the Black press. So I was used to covering issues that were relevant and germane to the African-American community in the Twin Cities. So unfortunately, covering issues like police brutality and police killings was something that I was used to doing. North News is not ethnic, but geographic. And so it has a geographic border and boundary. And even though North Minneapolis is about 60% African-American, we have a large Hmong population, Somali American population, and white population, but we have, our borders are more defined. However, so the killing of Mr. Floyd took place in South Minneapolis, and transitioning out of the role was Kinsey O'Keefe as the editor-in-chief, but she was still with the organization that actually is our parent company, Pillsbury United Communities. And Kinsey and I, when this happened, she just asked me how I was doing, and I said I didn't know, and I still don't know how I'm doing. But she said, well, if there's if there's an angle, if there's a North Minneapolis angle, let's see if we can do this. And then as the day progressed and more was happening, and then I was just kind of given the autonomy from Adair Mosley, who's the president of Pillsbury United, and he said, let's not worry about the border right now. This is bigger than a specific border. And unfortunately, it came to our doorstep anyway, because much of the unrest came up and down West Broadway. I live in North Minneapolis. The grocery store, the convenience store and gas station that's 4 blocks from my house, on Friday, I woke up to it on fire. And it wasn't an uncommon occurrence. There's several businesses that are on fire that were on fire here in North Minneapolis.
Thank you very much. And we're going to come back in a minute to everybody and talk about the history of some of these places. But first, Gabe, thank you joining us. Gabe, you actually in DC?
I am, yeah, right downtown actually. Yep.
Cool. So what were you up to? 2 weeks ago, I guess, 2.5 weeks ago. I know you're already working kind of in these spaces. It's probably not completely foreign to you either. But what were you working on?
I was working on the president's executive order that was intended, motivated to counter bias on large internet platforms, at least according to the order. But we had raised significant concerns that it could be used to chill speech on the platform. So it feels like 2 years ago.
Yeah. So, and then what was the transition like? Are you on the ground? Are you more in the office? Like, what have you really been up to in the past couple of last week?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously we've all gone remote, and we've in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm not out there that often, so kind of stuck in my house. But I mean, when we started getting reports of violence against journalists, law enforcement violence against journalists, obviously we were deeply concerned, but we immediately pivoted because, I'll probably get back to this at some point. There's a real, so first of all, we're collecting historically incidents of arrests or assaults against journalists. We've seen the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which we're a part of, has over 300 reports, and they're working to confirm those reports. I think they've confirmed maybe 20 or 30, but they're actually doing the reporting to figure out whether they can put it up as a confirmed instance. So you're talking about 300 incidents. That's historically unprecedented. There's just nothing, and a lot of media lawyers have said the same thing, that they've never seen anything quite like it. And I think part of what's going on, one of the concerns that I have, and that we've been trying to put the word out, is this isn't your typical excessive force case in the legal context of what kind of legal immunity a law enforcement officer would have for arresting or assaulting a clearly identifiable journalist. And you've seen incident after incident where the reporter is saying press, 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 the credential right there. The officer is very close, and they arrest or assault the journalist anyways. And that's not the typical what's called qualified immunity in the ability to take a civil rights claim against the officer for doing that. That right, particularly where you are, by the way, in Massachusetts in the First Circuit, that right is what's called clearly established, which means there's no legal immunity for that at all. And I think there's a concern that knowledge is not filtering down to the individual officers who may not realize that they could be subject to a civil lawsuit for doing this, which would have a deterrent effect on that activity.
Well, we will definitely, you said it, we'll definitely be going back to that, I think. So I don't want to have this conversation, even though we're specifically drilling down on journalists in the field, without history and context. Let's just swing it right back around to Kristen. Philadelphia, I think of MOVE bombings. I think unbelievable horrors of the past. What is a reporter where you are? And maybe it's national context too, but a reporter, 20 years of your paper, what are you and what are your editors saying even before you go out? This is, what you need to know. This is what this is all happening.
So I went out on the third day of protests in Philadelphia. The protest didn't begin until Saturday. I went out on a Monday. And we had, I believe it was 3 or maybe 4 of my colleagues who were either tear gassed or had equipment stolen. Someone was, had his, was physically harmed by a protester. And so, there was a little bit of precedent for what I was doing. And, I kind of talked to my colleagues and they said, wear a helmet. They said, I wear glasses, as you can see, but sometimes I wear contact lenses. And someone said, don't wear contact lenses because if you are tear gassed, then that'll be a problem. Just the usual, things you think of when you cover something where you're going to cover a lot of ground, bring snacks, stuff like that. And so that was the history. I mean, the police, before the unrest over Mr. Floyd's killing broke out, there hadn't been a lot of activity around this. I mean, we had some, certainly some protests around Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, things like that, but nothing, super violent. Very recently, obviously, there's a long history of, the MOVE bombing and things like that. But in terms of like specifically threats to journalists, going into it, it wasn't like that was at the top of my mind.
Okay, Harry, you're in Minneapolis, and I wanted to ask you specifically. Here in Boston, I'm a white guy who covers the Black community, has covered the Black community for many years, and I can't tell you how many times people, particularly idiots from other places, say there's Black people in Boston. We get a lot of this, right? And when we talk about Minneapolis, I mean, it's even like, what is it, a Chris Rock joke? Like, there's 2 Black people in Minnesota, Kirby Puckett and Prince, right? And there's this, and this is a conversation I've had with Black friends in particular from the Twin Cities in the past couple of weeks. When we talk about history, and also now, since so many eyeballs are on Minneapolis, what do you have to tell us reporters, and what should people know about, what is the context here? Black community, and sure, policing and journalism too, but just in general, since we have you here, please, put us somewhere where we can understand what's going on a little better.
Well, first, I know that there's some Black people in Boston because my family went to Northeastern University in 1979. So there was at least one. But in Minneapolis, you have, actually, I was surprised when I moved here. I'm a transplant from St. Louis, Missouri, and we'll talk about that as well. But when I moved here, one of the first things I was wondering was, what was the Black population like? And I was pleasantly surprised to find out that there's a large Black population in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In Minneapolis, traditionally in the North and South Minneapolis neighborhoods, and in St. Paul, an area called Rondo. And Minneapolis is home to some of the largest Fortune 500 companies, Target, Cargill, Best Buy, 3M, many others, Land O'Lakes. I can just keep naming them. With that being said, and so it's a very prosperous place. With that being said, it's prosperous for white people. It has the second largest disparities in wealth and education, I think only to Mississippi, in terms of educating our Black children, and in terms of wealth gap, home ownership, unemployment. So it's definitely a tale of 2 cities. So when you're talking about the unrest that's happening right here in Minneapolis, there are multiple layers, which always there are layers to this. And when we talk about what happened on Memorial Day with the killing of George Floyd, there are so many systemic layers that have to kind of be peeled away so that we can really get to the root of the problem. So yeah, we're outraged that George Floyd was killed. We're also outraged that Philando Castile was killed. And we're also outraged that Jamar Clark was killed. And we're also outraged that at one point, the Minneapolis Public Schools is doing almost a 50% job in educating our children of color. We're outraged that COVID is in the midst, and in the state of Minnesota, disproportionately Black people are being affected by COVID. And we're outraged by all of those factors. And that outrage just obviously reached a boiling point with the brutal 8-minute and 46-second live videotape murder of George Floyd.
Thank you very much. Gabe, I know we could probably talk about precedents and history for a long time. Let's just go back a little bit, and I'm kind of curious as to whether it's Wes Lowry at the time, Washington Post, being arrested in Ferguson, and basically Ferguson and what happened in the immediate wake of Ferguson. What can you tell us as somebody who, your work is right there? What change? We saw some really foul behavior toward journalists, toward the public. Did anything change? Where are we from there? From your perspective, an attorney really watches closely, what has happened.
Yeah, I'm still sort of collating the research that we've been doing, just in terms of trying to figure out exactly that question. Sort of, how, I think it's pretty clear that this is different. I think the question is, how different is it, and is it because the protests are nationwide? Is it because they're just simply larger in terms of the number of participants, or is there something else there? I mean, I would say so. And I'm going to be a lawyer, so this is going to be boring for a while, but the research that I've been doing on Ferguson specifically is, and the Reporters Committee sent a letter with a large number of signatories. One other thing I should mention too is the Reporters Committee sent a letter to the Minnesota public safety officials earlier this week, and we had 115 signatories, news organizations from local, state, national, international, all the major broadcasts. I mean, just everybody. So a pretty powerful statement. Basically saying cut it out, right? Institute protocols immediately that inform your officers that they can't do this. So we sent a letter in the context of Ferguson as well. The incidents there seem somewhat isolated. You're talking about. In New York, we're trying to figure out exactly how many there are at this point, and I think you're talking about sort of 15 that look pretty egregious in this sense. That in Ferguson, there's I think one Section 1983 case that came out of Ferguson. There may be a couple more, but the one that I've looked at was an Al Jazeera camera crew, and the question, the reason. Why the judge, so there was a factual consideration there as to whether the light from the stand-up could be clearly identified as a journalist. In other words, did the officers know that it was a journalist, and then they shot tear gas canisters at their location. Here, you're not seeing any of that ambiguity. Or at least it's actually rare in the small minority of cases. So many of these cases, documented on camera, including by the person doing the recording, are like you saw with I think Tom Aviles in Minneapolis, where he is saying, I am press. The officers are advancing, they break away, they come towards him, he's compliant, and they arrest him after having shot him with a rubber bullet. I'm not aware of other cases like that. So it's in terms of why it changed, I can't speak to motivation. But I do think that the officers on the ground need to understand that there are consequences for them as well.
Excellent. And Harry just wrote here, thankfully as of today, no more tear gas allowed in Minneapolis unless the chief gives an order. Oh, we're going to talk about tear gas for sure. Let's get there in a second. So Kristen, you are here with us, and I really appreciate it. I know it's still raw. You did write a piece. I'll throw a couple things out there from it. I don't expect you to relive it, whatever you're comfortable with. I would like you to talk about the arrest. It doesn't have to be minute to minute, but the things that I really picked up is that you weren't the only reporter arrested. You were fully identified down to the press badge. One thing that really struck me about it is how they walked up behind you and really touched you, removed your helmet on you. That kind of blew me away. A major thing, and this could be a 10-hour conversation right here, but this is the issue that it was my arrest. It's almost every time. It's the whole, you don't know where you're supposed to stand. Even if you're out of the way, they can designate that. And the other thing is just what an unbelievably traumatic experience it was. You were on a bus with someone who was having an asthma attack who vomited. And so I'll stop there, but whatever you're comfortable with, please just, this is one, your story was all over the place, the one that, your recap. So please.
Sure.
Tell us what happened.
So I had covered a protest. Protesters walked probably about 4 miles from one part of Center City, Philadelphia to another, and walked to basically an entrance to the Vine Street Expressway, which is a major interstate that runs through the city. And there was tear gas fired. I got a little bit of I got tear gassed, but was, okay to keep reporting. So after the protest dispersed, there was a 6 p.m. curfew. Probably the protest broke up about 6:15. So I am walking from, where I had been reporting back to my car, which I had parked near the Inquirer's headquarters, about 2 miles away. And, as I'm walking, I, encountered several police officers who said, where are you headed? This is past curfew. And I identified myself as a reporter. They said, make sure your press pass is very visible. I'd had it kind of more hidden lower on my shirt, brought it up, and they were like, that's good. So, continued to walk. And then I got to Philadelphia City Hall. And I saw a bunch of officers and some buses that were clearly taking people who had been arrested, presumably to police stations. And so, I was walking that way. There were no barricades, there were no signs. No one told me not to walk there. So I'm, walking behind these officers, snapped a photo because I was still tweeting at that point of one of the buses, and someone turned around and kind of said to me, like, what are you doing here? You can't be here. And I was like, oh, I'm just a reporter. I'm walking back to my car, pointed to my press pass. They were like, okay, yeah, turn around. So I turned around immediately, compliant, no problem with that. And then as I walked back, 2 officers came and kind of one each took my hand and they put my hands behind my back. I was wearing that helmet and was holding my cell phone. I had a backpack on my back. They took my cell phone out of my hands. They took my helmet off my head, took my backpack. And I said, I'm a reporter, and obviously my hands are not free at this point, but I'm kind of like motioning with my chin to my press pass, and they acknowledged it. They didn't say like, we see you're a reporter, but they were like, kind of shaking their heads like, we don't care that you're a reporter. And so at that point, they fitted, the handcuffs to my wrists, and put me on a bus. There were several buses waiting. I was the first person on my bus. They filled my bus with females who had been detained. And then there was another bus where they were putting men who had been detained. And as other people are coming on the bus, I was probably waiting there for, 35 minutes before the bus moved. And so of course I'm asking people like, what did they pick you up for? And I think everyone I talked to said, I was just walking home, or a couple people were riding home, and sort of were, hit that same point at City Hall where there were no barricades. And, and in some cases, like the people who were riding their bikes, they just told them to get off their bikes and like didn't chain them up or anything. They had my backpack, and they put it on the bus. I was obviously in the part where the people who were detained, the arrested people were. They put my backpack on the front part of the bus and said, make sure, when they take you to the station for processing, that you take this with you, that you tell the officer that this is yours. So I didn't have my cell phone. I didn't have anything like that. But it was on the bus with me. I was never separated from it. Waited on the bus for, 35, 40 minutes until it filled up. And then they took us to a police station in North Philadelphia for processing. At that point, I had kind of MacGyvered my wrists, one of my wrists out of the cuffs. And I still had my Apple Watch on. And I managed to use my Apple Watch to text my editor, to tell my editor what was happening, and to tell my husband what was happening. I have 2 small kids. I knew my husband was probably frantic, because I'd been tweeting. He was following my tweets, following my, and I was text messaging saying I'm on my way to my car. And then I guess probably 45 minutes later, an officer came on the bus and pulled me and another reporter from the Wilmington News Journal. Actually, it was a photographer from the Wilmington News Journal who was a woman, and then a male reporter who was on the other bus. And they pulled us all off our buses, and, and police captain said, this was a mistake. We shouldn't have arrested you. Can I give you a ride somewhere? And
well, at least they offered you a ride.
Yeah, it was probably like 3 hours from start to finish. Yeah, probably about 3 hours.
Well, thank you very much for sharing.
Sure.
Harry, if I worked for CNN and one of my colleagues was arrested in Minneapolis, I would probably have on a bunch of other journalists who were on the scene to learn about their experience. I don't work for CNN, so we'll have to do it right here. You know, you mentioned tear gas, which has been completely out of hand out there. But I mean, if you just want to bring us to the ground, and in particular, you know, I know you're not from there originally, but you've been in the region for a while. You know, I know not surprised at police violence in general, but with some of the tactics being used, bring us to the scene when you know, the first time you got on there and saw some of this militarization.
The answer is no and no. I wasn't surprised. It did par for the course. I mean, but keep in mind, I come at it from a lens of being a Black man first. I don't have, I can't take it off like a badge. So I'm always Black. And so I always feel that there can be that instance of being targeted. Earlier, I said I was going to take it back to St. Louis. Well, I used to be a reporter for the North County and County Star Journal. My beat was Ferguson, Florissant, Delwood, Belnor, Bell Ridge, and a city called Jennings. Jennings was so bad that Officer Darren Wilson actually came from Jennings to the city of Ferguson before he killed Mike Brown. Jennings was so bad that they disbanded the force. And when I was a reporter for the North County Journal, I used to drive a beat up 88 Toyota Celica, and I call and I tell them, this is my car, this is my license plate, don't pull me over. I'm here to cover a school board meeting. That's all I want to do, is cover a school board meeting. Now when we come to Minnesota, when Jamar Clark was killed in November of 2015, there were those heavy-handed tactics with protesters, and of course, as a journalist, we saw that and were witness to it. When the Philando Castile killing occurred in 2016, less than a year later from Jamar Clark, I was driving up to the governor's mansion in St. Paul. And as I was driving, there was a group of Black men, either teens or early 20s. And basically, you could tell that the police were waiting for this group to get out of, become less visible to the general public. So they turned onto the side street. When they turned onto the side street, which is where I just happened to be because I was trying to find a parking spot, they immediately just converged on these guys who were just walking. And so I pulled out my phone to record because I was trying to figure out, like, okay, did they have some intel that these guys had done something a long time ago? Because they certainly didn't do anything to be pulled over like this at that moment. So I'm got my cell phone out, and as soon as I stopped my car, an officer comes to me and she's like, "Move your car now." And I'm like, I have my press badge on the rearview mirror, and I'm like, I'm pressed. And she's like, "Move, move, or you're getting arrested." And she's got her hand on her gun at this point. And so another car has come in and has actually blocked my car in, so I can't even move. And I'm like, I can't move. I'm like, at this point, I'm nervous because you're giving me an order that I can't even comply with. And you're like, "Move or you'll get arrested." You got your hand towards your gun or on your gun. And I'm videotaping, and I've got my door open and trying to make sure I don't lunge the car forward or any of that. So that was my one instance of interaction with police in one of those moments. And I'm like, I'm showing you I'm the press. I'm recording everything, but obviously we've come to find out that recording doesn't mean much anymore. Thankfully, it's bringing the situation to light now, but I'm recording. I got my press pass on the visor or whatever. And at the same time, I'm still being told I'm going to be arrested because I just happen to be in this position. So what's happening at all doesn't surprise me. And when the brother from CNN was arrested on live television, I wrote on my Facebook page that the only journalists that are surprised are Black journalists.
Okay.
It's kind of par for the course.
Thank you. So, you know, we've seen, let's see, Gabe, you said that we're at about 300 now.
Yeah.
You know, and I know it's tough to count. And I know you've already said it's unprecedented. That I was obviously going to ask that, but I just want to go a couple arrests. We've seen reporters beaten, tear gassed, accosted on air, and this isn't just by police. These are also, you know, fascist thugs, if you will, more of a European phenomenon. Eastern European in particular, we're now seeing here, shot at, pepperballed. Linda Tirado, I believe it is, blinded in Minneapolis. I saw, I apologize, I can't recall where it was, but one headline that this is different in the sense that it's police see themselves at war. You know, the protests are directly against them. I'm not asking you to say if that's the case or not, but sure, it's unprecedented in the sheer number of what's, you know, there's tons of protests, a lot of arrests, but is there something else unprecedented about it, about the nature of this, about police in so many cities, since we're here talking about press in particular, just not giving a damn about reporters identifying as such, at least not on the ground? And I know that's what you're trying to figure out, but tell us what you figured out already, if anything.
You know, it's so hard to get a 30,000 foot view of all of it as it sort of keeps developing. You know, there have been a number of reports where it does seem pretty clear that not only did the officer know that the person was a journalist, but you know, was sort of like take it up with the department, or you know, there was a case like that in Minneapolis. And you know, there have been a couple of cases in New York where, you know, the AP reporters who were hassled because of an ostensible curfew violation, and there's a whole lot going on there from a legal standpoint, but I'll spare everybody. But you know, but in those cases, you know, I'm saying I'm press, and you know, the officers, you know, just disregard it. And so, you know, I do think, and again, we're trying to figure all of this out as it's unfolding. I do think a lot of it may have to do with the qualified immunity issue, you know, and the idea behind that is when law enforcement is making split-second decisions, you know, the courts generally won't second-guess those decisions. But that only applies, and this is really what's so disturbing about all of these stories, about Harry's story, Kristen's story, is that we're not talking about the usual qualified immunity case where, you know, where there's some ambiguity. I mean, first of all, there is a constitutional right to record police activity in public. This is when I keep saying things are clearly established. The case law, the emerging case law on that legal question, is the right to record protected by the First Amendment, and is that right clearly established such that there is no qualified immunity for a law enforcement officer who interferes with the exercise of that right? You know, that is not only is it the law, it is going to be the law in every circuit that looks at these cases.
Right.
And we've seen that in New York. You know, we've seen it, and so the fact that the law is being is being disregarded in such a flagrant way, I mean, that just needs to stop. There needs to be some kind of, you know, protocol in place that says that, you know, the shift commanders and the sergeants and, you know, the managers of the officers who are doing these things need to tell the officers that you can't just bump it to the department. It will be you. And we're talking about, you know, protracted litigation, but, you know, hopefully that could have a deterrent effect on all of these things happening. So it's you know, it really, it's pretty amazing. And I would also say that, you know, it's not, obviously it's not, we work on the press issues, but some of the things that you saw in DC, I mean, literally 4 or 5 blocks from where I am right now, where, you know, obviously peaceful protesters were subject to police charges, tear gas was used, to disperse the crowd. There is potentially an international incident because an ABC broadcast crew was reporting off to the side. I mean, you can see it from multiple angles, and you see one of the officers coming through, breaking off, and then hitting the crew with the riot shield, literally hitting the camera with the riot shield. So, we're working on the press issues, but it's important to note that the right to record, and the First Amendment right to document police activity in public is clearly established. And when you violate that right, you don't have legal immunity. And that applies to both the press and the public because those rights are coextensive. So.
Cool. So we have about 15 minutes left. I just want to keep it with you for 1 second, Gabe, because I just want to. Both Harry and Kristen have mentioned press passes. I know a lot of people who will end up watching this are in Massachusetts. We have this remarkable situation where there are no press passes. There is one, and it's really only Beacon Hill related to the State House. It is the Wild West out there. So I'm just going to merge that right into a question I had for you is I've been, as an editor, having this conversation with my reporters. They got to be reporters out there. Don't be with people who have signs, this, that, I have a few of those that I give them, having been through a 4-year lawsuit over this.
Yeah.
7 videos of me taking notes. They're still trying to prove I'm not a journalist. Yeah. Just give us a few things that are universally applicable that reporters need to know. They're out there. Don't hold a sign. Give me a couple others. And if you just want to address press passes, we do obviously make our own, but there are no state issued ones besides the State House ones here.
Yeah, well, so let me make a plug first because let me make a plug for both our website, rcfp.org. We have a number of resources up there. We have a guide that's dedicated to guidance on journalists covering protests. So I would definitely refer you to that. We also have resources up there that we've started creating over the last week. We have a map that has all of the curfew orders that we've been able to find, including whether there's a media exemption or not. I would also say, incidentally, as I say, the curfew stuff as a legal matter is a complete, right. Like there's no law on this, which is, it's crazy. As far as I can tell, there's literally no law on one, whether curfews without a media exemption are unconstitutional, and 2, whether journalists who have been arrested for an ostensible curfew violation, have ever, tried to, do anything about it. So anyways, that's a best. I would point you to that. And then, it's as a legal matter, and what we're going to try. I think what we're going to start seeing is the evidentiary question, I think, will be whether the officer knew that the person was a reporter. And in many of these cases, right? The credentials are, the credentials can be kind of a sticky issue because if you have to have government issued credentials in order to report during a curfew, that's literally a prior restraint. It's like Pentagon Papers.
Right.
So so that's, that can happen. But it is, carry your business card. If you're reporting, make sure somebody knows where you are. As you say, I think when you're saying, don't carry a sign, you're saying don't be part of the protest, right?
Even close to it. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right, exactly. So, and I think, yeah, you off to the side, make it clear that you are documenting, the activity. And then all of the usual things where make it clear that you're a reporter. If they try and arrest, don't resist. Again, make sure people know where you are and that you can contact folks. The other thing I was going to say is we have a hotline. The Reporters Committee has a hotline. So for the sticky questions, or if folks need counsel, we could we know counsel in jurisdictions around the country. So you can't.
You're on auto dial. Don't worry.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right, so I'm going to let's go back to Kristen and then Harry. This is really for both of you. We're talking about this, and I don't want to go as far as to say sacrifice, but I guess especially with coronavirus, it is. Kristen, you're an education reporter, basically volunteered to go out there and do this. Harry, you're an editor, and I know we're both in small operations, but you could just be behind the desk. please, the way I had phrased it on my notes is, Kristen, why don't you start us? What's the difference between, why is this important to cover on the ground? You know, why not from a helicopter? Why not from home? We're watching someone else's feed. And really, that's for both of you. And let's just get I'd like to hear it from both of you, because you're both doing this.
Because I think these are historic times and we need to bear witness. I mean, I think in general, you know, you want to do as much in-person journalism as you can. Obviously, you know, things were different when, you know, there was more of a lockdown during COVID. And yeah, I mean, there was a risk. I wore a mask, everything like that. But I mean, this is historic. Things are, you know, this is, you know, a civil rights moment. This is a time of great turmoil and change. And, you know, it's not something that you can phone it in. And, you know, to folks who aren't able to cover it in person, who have, you know, health issues or other concerns, I completely understand that. I'm lucky enough to work at an organization where it's big enough that, you know, if people don't want to go out, you don't need to go out. There are enough of us who are willing to go out. And so I felt like I was in a position to do that. And, you know, I felt really strongly that I wanted to be there and like see the looks on people's faces and, you know, find people in the crowd and interview them and, you know, and to feel what it was like when they fired the tear gas.
And Harry, you know, whether it's we're talking about on the ground, or even, you know, talking to real people, you know, as opposed to the helicopter shot, please tell us about, you know, the motivations, you know, and just the importance of being out there, really covering.
It's my obligation, in particular, as a black person living in America. That's the reality of it, and that's the truth of it. At the end of it, it's not hyperbole to say that George Floyd could have been me. It's not hyperbole to say that Philando could have been me, or that Jamar Clark could have been me. I feel it daily when I'm out in public. And so it's my obligation to tell this story. Again, my previous paper, that was actually our mission as being a part of the Black press, was to tell the stories that weren't being told in traditional press. But I still carry that mission with my new organization, North News. And you're making very conscious decisions, especially in the age of COVID. I'm about to be 50 this year, and I'm Black, and we know that COVID is disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. And the older you get, the worse it can be for you. And so I had to weigh that. And when you're out there, you're not being able to socially distance. Yeah, you wear the mask, but at press conferences I've covered, what good is a mask when the person right next to me is right here, and then right here, and then one over your head, all trying to get the shot. But I made a conscious decision that this was too important to my community to not be there to cover. It's personal for me.
And Harry, we have a question here on the Zoom chat. You know, so can you just tell us, obviously there's so much more important than just what's happening during the protests, covering trauma, and you know, maybe we want to stay away from policy moving forward, but whatever, you know, what are the other things that, whether you've done them already or you're about to, that what else does covering this mean to you as an editor in particular?
We absolutely are doing a series on trauma, and actually I'm a member of the Twin Cities Association of Black Journalists and the National Association of Black Journalists. And this past Saturday, we had an internal Zoom call just to address the trauma that we as journalists were experiencing. And it was very cathartic and it was emotional. And when we get done with that meeting, you have to deal with the reality of what's going on in the streets. And then at night, get a call from a friend who's saying, hey, look, they're talking about potentially bringing the activities over to my business. Can you come help me guard? Because we got intel. The governor and people from the state got intel that white supremacists were using the protest as a way for them to come in and kind of cause havoc and harm in the community. So thankfully, the company I work for, Pillsbury United Communities, we got an email this week saying, hey, we're going to offer you free therapy for anyone who needs it. And I'm like, oh, I need it.
Oh, wow. That's I get some promise. Thank you, by the way. So we have a couple more, and this has been really, again, thank you everyone for your time. A couple here. So Gabe, I don't want to go. I know it's the nature of your work. Everything's a rabbit hole. I know. But I have to, having been through this, and I don't know if he's on the call. I did send him the link. My attorney, Adam Mandel. I had a private attorney. He's a friend from college. Mm-hmm. Who I did not, probably never cried so much in my life. When it was over, he told me he wasn't taking any attorney fees. It wasn't about the money at all ever, but I was very fortunate. I have a friend in this position, etc. What are the chances? What I went through, we're talking more than 50 court appearances, horror, threats to my family, and even not even being in the same city. And I'm in a privileged position, plus white guy, the whole deal, right? Mm-hmm. What are the chances of actually suing for some of these horrific things that are happening to reporters? They're happening to other people too. I want to acknowledge that. Yeah. But, we're here, we're having SPJ talk. I have an injury for life in my right arm. Not horrible, but this gets felt constantly. What recourse is there, if anything?
There is the recourse that you took, but as you say, you're talking about.
It's almost impossible as far as
Right. And was yours was a 1983 claim, I assume?
I don't remember exactly what it ended up being. It'll take two, but basically, I ended up with a settlement. But really, it was more about the way. For me, the most significant thing about my lawsuit was that New York didn't want to deal with it. They took the corporation counsel the police wouldn't even talk to their own lawyers for 2 years. Stonewalling is very easy. I'm just, what are you telling journalists? Is it even worth it? How is this? Because obviously the calls are coming in. What are the chances here?
Yeah, well, so every case is going to be a little bit different. I'm not trying to deflect.
No, totally.
It's really true. Each case will be an individual assessment of, what is your, appetite to do this. It's certainly, a hassle for the officers, which it should be, because that will stop them from doing this. But it's a commitment. Getting involved in any litigation, certainly something like this where you've been injured, is something you got to think about. So what I would say is, if anybody is thinking about that or has had something happen to them, contact our hotline, and we can talk to you. We can talk to you about some of that. We can't provide legal advice over the hotline, but we can certainly talk to you, and we're eager to hear about the cases and report them to the Press Freedom Tracker. And it's important to get all that stuff out. The other thing I would say too, by the way, is that it's funny. A completely separate case came down today, not related to anything like this, but it was Brian Karam, Playboy's White House correspondent, had his press pass suspended because of an altercation at a Rose Garden event, and they claimed that he was somehow they claimed that he didn't act with appropriate decorum, and he sued the White House and then Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham under this. I'll spare you the details, but basically it brought up this kind of obscure case from the 70s called Cheryl, which involved a reporter for the Nation who was denied credentials on security grounds. That reporter sued and won under the First Amendment, but the case has always been a little bit tough to parse out because it doesn't happen that much. But because of the fact that the White House sued, we just had a decision in the DC Circuit, I think I need to look at the case closely, clarifying the scope of Cheryl, which everybody can now use that case, right? So we've got Cheryl 2, makes the law better. So I think in this case, and I will bring it back, I swear, but I think in this case, a lot of these incidents, if they do go forward, will clarify this whole thing I've been talking about before, whether the right to record police activity, what Ari was talking about before, is clearly established under the First Amendment, and therefore there's no legal immunity. And I do suspect that will be one of the outcomes of this, because it's going to generate, an enormous amount of, because I suspect it will generate litigation, and litigation involving journalists.
Thank you very much, Gabe, and everybody. I have one more quickie to wrap up with Harry and Kristen. But Gabe, thank you very much, and I really hope everybody go to the Reporters Committee website. The resources are phenomenal, and if you're a journalist, that's tattoo it on your arm. Don't even bother with the marker. That phone number of theirs. So Harry, I'll finish with you. Kristen, let's just do you real quick. So I see you already have 2 bylines. Since your byline about what happened to you,
Yep.
Moving forward, I don't have to ask if you're working. You are. Do you see yourself getting out there?
Absolutely.
What kind of report? Yeah. What's the deal?
Yeah.
What do you
Yeah. I mean, was this dramatic? Of course it was dramatic, but I feel strongly that, this is something that I'm honor bound to do, and, I'll do it for as long as I'm needed and as long as I can. I'm back at it tomorrow.
And Harry, I have to ask you, you're dealing with this personally. You're an editor. You have the, you don't have the luxury of separating those things. And I really appreciate you sharing that. But tell us, as not just to white reporters, but just reporters in general, please, do you have any, can you tell us how we can deal with these issues and talk about them, even with our our own social media followers, with our readerships, our other reporters, in a way that they don't take away from what the hell is going on here, the much larger, ongoing for hundreds of years issue?
Yeah. Well, one, what you guys are doing already is part of the solution. You're telling your truth. And I think that's something, I know I'm old school, and as journalists, we're taught to be the fly on the wall, and we're not supposed to be the story.
Right.
And so a lot of the things that happen to us, we just we might talk about it when we're sitting at the bar with someone, but we don't tell our truth. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, we're hiding the story, thinking that we're being the proper journalist. So we need to make sure that we're telling our truths. That's kind of first and foremost in terms of a takeaway. And I'm like, it pains me to hear the story that happened to you, and the story that happened to Kristen. And as much as it pains me, again, it doesn't surprise me. We need to make sure that we are vigilant in holding law enforcement at every level accountable. And I just keep thinking back when I was young, and I'd see foreign war correspondents, and you're like, wow, look at what they have to deal with. It really didn't occur to me at that time that we'd be dealing with that here in St. Louis and in Boston and in Minneapolis and in Atlanta, and name the city that you can think of. Because we always thought that, we're America, we're above that, we're a democracy, we have freedom of the press. It's the absolute First Amendment in the Constitution. But be vigilant, tell the story.
Thank you very much. I'm not even going to add anything on top of that. This is fantastic. I don't usually make my reporters watch these things, but this is going to be, almost mandatory. But really, everybody who participated, everybody who came in, it's Friday. That's how important this is. I really appreciate all the participation, people watching. Share this, and really, everybody, this was fantastic. Have a great weekend, and that's all I got. Let's keep at it, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Peace.
Take care.
See ya.